No one expected Frank Lucas to show up like this. Not with guards, not with threats, not with the sharp edge everyone associated with his name. He arrived quietly, moving through Harlem with an expression that gave nothing away, while behind him came something that made people stop and stare. Trays of food, carefully prepared, enough for everyone. The kind of banquet reserved for celebrations, not power moves. Whispers began before he even spoke. In a neighborhood where every gesture carried weight, this one felt deliberately ambiguous. And ambiguity in Harlem was never accidental. The food wasn't rushed in or displayed loudly. It was placed with care, almost reverence. Frank stood back, letting people look, letting confusion spread. Some thought it was mockery. Others suspected a trap hidden behind generosity. A few understood immediately that this wasn't about hunger or hospitality. It was about memory. Bumpy Johnson's name hovered in the air, unspoken but heavy. Frank hadn't said a word yet, and already the room felt divided between curiosity and unease. Everyone sensed this moment would be talked about long after the plates were cleared. Frank finally spoke, but only enough to confirm what many feared and others hoped. The banquet was prepared in Bumpy Johnson's name, not as nostalgia, not as a story for outsiders, as acknowledgement. The reaction was subtle but powerful. Postures changed, eyes narrowed, breathing slowed. Some men felt honored by the reminder, others felt exposed by it. And if you're enjoying stories where every silence matters and every gesture has consequences, take a second right now to subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss what comes next. Harlem had seen plenty of men invoke Bumpy's name before, usually to borrow respect they hadn't earned. This felt different. Frank didn't boast. He didn't explain himself. He let the name do the work. That restraint was unsettling. In a world where power often demanded noise, this move felt surgical. The question wasn't why he did it. It was what he expected to happen next. Because no one brings a banquet into Harlem without understanding that someone eventually will test it. Eyes scanned the room, measuring reactions. Some men leaned back, arms crossed, waiting to see who would speak first. Others avoided eye contact entirely. The food cooled slowly, untouched, as if everyone understood eating too soon would mean choosing a side. Frank remained still, watching, absorbing. This wasn't generosity meant to please. It was patience meant to reveal. In that stillness, the tension grew sharper than any raised voice could have managed. By the time the first plate was finally taken, the meaning had already shifted. This was no longer about a meal. It was about boundaries, about who remembered the rules and who thought they no longer applied. Frank Lucas hadn't come to announce power. He came to expose disrespect without naming it. And in Harlem, once disrespect showed itself publicly, there was only one possible ending. The food continued to be arranged with careful precision, plate after plate placed as if each one carried a message of its own. Old faces watched closely, men who had survived long enough to know that in Harlem, nothing ever arrived by accident. Meals weren't just meals, they were signals, invitations, sometimes traps. The smell filled the room, rich and warm, but no one rushed forward. Hunger wasn't the issue. Understanding was. Every pair of eyes seemed to ask the same silent question. What does this really mean? Frank Lucas remained calm, almost detached, as if he were observing rather than hosting. When he finally spoke, his voice stayed low and steady, never rising above the room. He mentioned Bumpy Johnson without ceremony, without embellishment. Not as a myth, not as a memory to be romanticized, but as a benchmark, a measure of how things were supposed to be done. The words landed carefully, each one chosen to avoid emotion while carrying unmistakable intent. This wasn't praise, it was alignment. Some men nodded subtly, recognizing the tone immediately. They had lived through the era Frank was pointing to. They understood what it meant to invoke Bumpy's name this way, not to borrow power, but to acknowledge rules that still applied. To them, Frank sounded respectful, even disciplined, but others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They heard something else beneath the calm delivery, a reminder, a correction, and corrections in Harlem were rarely offered twice. The room felt divided in a way that had nothing to do with sides and everything to do with awareness. Those who understood stayed quiet, listening for what wasn't being said. Those who didn't leaned forward, searching for reassurance that never came. Frank didn't look at anyone directly for too long. He let the words settle on their own, trusting the weight of history to do the work. Silence stretched again, thick and intentional. A few men exchanged glances, the kind that asked for confirmation without speaking. Was this admiration, or was it a warning wrapped in courtesy? Frank's posture never changed. He didn't defend his meaning, didn't clarify. In Harlem, explanations were for people who didn't belong. Meaning was something you were expected to recognize on your own. And the longer Frank allowed the room to sit with his words, the clearer it became that this moment wasn't about comfort. It was about exposure. By the time he finished speaking, the energy had shifted completely. What began as curiosity hardened into something more serious. The banquet no longer felt welcoming. It felt ceremonial, like a line being drawn in plain sight. Some men relaxed, relieved to know where things stood. Others felt the slow pressure of realization. They were hearing two different messages in the same words. And in Harlem, misunderstanding a message like this was never forgiven. The laugh cut through the room softly, but it traveled far. It wasn't meant to challenge, just to dismiss. The kind of sound made by someone who believed the moment had already been figured out. Heads turned slowly. The man followed it with a remark that sounded casual, almost playful, but carried an edge that couldn't be mistaken. Confidence wrapped it neatly, as if that alone made it harmless. The banquet seemed to change instantly. What had felt ambiguous now felt deliberate. Plates sat untouched. The food suddenly secondary to the shift in the air. Frank didn't look at the man right away. He didn't correct him or react. He stayed still, letting the sound of the laugh fade completely before doing anything else. That pause mattered. It stretched just long enough to separate those who understood from those who didn't. Some men lowered their eyes. Others leaned back slightly, already aware that something had crossed from possibility into certainty. In rooms like this, disrespect didn't need volume. It only needed to be witnessed. The man who laughed seemed unaware of what he'd done. He continued talking, filling the silence he didn't recognize as dangerous. His posture was relaxed, too relaxed, as if he believed humor had softened the room. But the room hadn't softened. It had closed. A few faces hardened, not in anger, but in acknowledgement. Frank remained quiet, absorbing every word, every gesture. This wasn't hesitation. It was assessment. He was letting the moment reveal its full shape before touching it. Those who knew Frank Lucas watched carefully. They recognized this stillness from other moments. Moments that didn't end loudly, but ended definitively. Frank had always understood timing better than force. He knew when to let someone finish speaking so there could be no confusion later about what had been said or meant. The disrespect now had a clear form. It wasn't implied anymore. It stood on its own, exposed and undeniable. The banquet felt heavier by the second, as if it had become something else entirely. No longer a gesture, no longer an offering. It had turned ceremonial, like a marker placed before a decision. The man's confidence began to thin, though he didn't yet understand why. He noticed the lack of reaction, mistook it for tolerance, and smiled again. That smile landed wrong. In Harlem, silence after disrespect wasn't forgiveness. It was preparation. Frank finally shifted his weight slightly, just enough to signal the pause had ended. The room tightened, almost imperceptibly. Disrespect had surfaced, clear and public. It now had a witness, and more importantly, it had context. Nothing violent had happened, nothing dramatic, yet everyone present understood that something irreversible had already taken place. The moment had passed, the point where words could undo it. What came next wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't need to be. Frank finally spoke, but he didn't turn toward the man who laughed. He looked around the room instead, letting his eyes pass slowly over every face. His voice was even, controlled, almost instructional. He didn't raise it to command attention, he assumed it. He began by speaking about memory, about how Harlem never forgot who showed up when things were hard and who disappeared when pressure arrived. Bumpy's name came up naturally, not as a threat or a legend, but as a reference point, a standard. Something fixed that didn't need defending because it had already been tested. He explained that names only mattered when they were carried with responsibility, that Harlem wasn't impressed by volume, speed, or ambition without roots. People listened closely now. The tone wasn't aggressive, but it left no room for interpretation. Frank spoke of moments when men were forced to choose between folding and standing firm, and how the neighborhood never confused the two. Bumpy was remembered not because he demanded respect, but because he never had to ask for it. That distinction settled heavily in the room. Frank paused briefly, letting the words sit where they landed. No one interrupted him. He continued by describing power as something quiet, something that didn't announce itself or rush to prove dominance. In Harlem, power lasted because it knew when to hold back. It didn't exploit legacy for convenience. It protected it. His gaze remained broad, never locking onto a single person. That choice made the message sharper. This wasn't a personal correction. It was a public clarification of how things worked here. The laughter from earlier felt distant now, almost embarrassing in hindsight. The man who had spoken shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of how exposed he was without being addressed directly. Frank didn't need to point him out. The room already had. Faces that once showed curiosity now showed recognition. Some nodded faintly, not in agreement but in understanding. This wasn't about punishing disrespect. It was about removing illusions that allowed disrespect to exist in the first place. Frank's words stripped away the idea that influence came from being new, loud, or feared. He made it clear that Harlem measured men by consistency, by memory, by what they protected rather than what they took. The banquet, once confusing, now made sense. It wasn't celebration, it was context, a reminder of who set the tone long before any of them walked into that room. The food sat untouched, no longer the focus, but no longer misunderstood. By the time Frank finished speaking, the energy had fully shifted. The laughter was gone, replaced by a tight, thoughtful silence. No one felt challenged, yet everyone felt addressed. That was the power of it. The message didn't demand obedience. It explained reality. And in Harlem, reality didn't need reinforcement. It only needed to be remembered. Frank didn't stand up or raise his voice. He made his move with the same restraint that had defined the entire night. A small gesture, almost easy to miss. He nodded once, subtle, and one of his men stepped forward to quietly remove a single chair from the table. Nothing else changed. No confrontation followed, but everyone understood the meaning instantly. The chair had belonged to the man who laughed. The action wasn't aggressive, yet it was final. It redrew the invisible map of the room, marking who was inside the circle of respect and who had just been moved outside of it. The man froze for a moment, unsure whether to react or stay still. His smile vanished as realization set in. The banquet hadn't been generosity, it hadn't been theater, it was a public measure of understanding, and he had failed it. Frank never looked at him directly, never explained the decision. He didn't need to. In Harlem, explanations after a move like that only weakened it. The message had already landed where it needed to. The food, the silence, The arrangement of the room, all of it now made sense in a way that couldn't be undone. No one objected. No one questioned it. That silence was the final confirmation. The line had been drawn cleanly, without violence, without chaos. The man who laughed understood that arguing would only deepen the mistake. What had been removed wasn't just a seat, it was standing. Frank remained calm, almost distant, as if nothing significant had occurred. But everyone there knew better. Respect had been defined publicly, and once that happened, there was no appeal. The banquet continued, but the balance of the room had shifted permanently. By the time the night began to thin out, the food had been eaten, plates cleared without ceremony. What lingered wasn't satisfaction, but understanding. Conversations stayed low, measured, stripped of bravado. Everyone present knew they had witnessed something precise and intentional. No voices needed to rise for the message to settle. Disrespect hadn't been argued with or punished publicly. It had simply been contained and concluded. In Harlem, echoes belonged to noise. This had been something cleaner, something final. And finality carried its own weight. Frank Lucas didn't linger to receive acknowledgement. He didn't wait for approval or reaction. When he left, it was quietly, the same way he arrived. No handshakes, no speeches, no closing remarks. That absence of ceremony mattered. It told the room that nothing had been performed for effect. What happened wasn't meant to impress, it was meant to correct. Those who watched him go understood that the most powerful moves rarely asked to be noticed. They revealed themselves only after it was too late to misunderstand them. From that night on, Bumpy Johnson's name returned to its proper place. Not whispered in fear, not shouted for leverage, but spoken with care. The clarity settled into the streets, into conversations, into decisions made weeks later. No one needed to reference the banquet again. It had already done its work. Some gestures don't ask for response or recognition. They don't start debates. They establish order quietly, firmly, and permanently, leaving nothing behind except a clear understanding of where the lines truly are.